The hull ticks with heat. 30 tons of welded steel sitting on a mudflat that shouldn't hold it. Engine running at idle because the driver can't remember if the starter works reliably, and nobody wants to find out. Fog rolls off the water in sheets thick enough to taste. River damp, diesel exhaust, something vegetal and rotting underneath. The Mosel in early March of 1945 smells like a drainage ditch. The Sherman's exhaust stack coughs a blue-gray plume into it, and the fog swallows everything past 15 yards. No radio traffic. The net has been dead for 40 minutes. Battalion doesn't know where this tank is. Neither does the company commander, who went to sleep 2 hours ago in a farmhouse cellar 4 miles west, assuming his armor had buttoned up for the night along the designated phase line. The phase line runs along a ridge. This Sherman sits 600 yards past it, down a farm track that doesn't appear on the tactical map, on a riverbank that nobody reconnoitered because nobody planned to be here until Thursday. Inside the turret, 3 of the 5 crew members are drunk, not falling down drunk. Functional drunk. The kind of drunk where a man's hands still work, but his risk calculus has collapsed entirely. They found the wine in a stone cellar outside Bernkastel, Mosel Riesling, 1938 vintage, 2 cases of it, abandoned by a Wehrmacht supply officer who left in enough of a hurry to forget his dress uniform hanging on a nail. The loader cracked the first bottle around 2100 hours. The gunner joined him. The tank commander, a staff sergeant from Akron, Ohio, whose name appears in the unit diary, but whose service record contains a gap between March 3rd and March 9th that nobody ever explained satisfactorily. The tank commander joined around 2200, and by midnight had made a decision that 3rd Army headquarters would not learn about for another 11 hours. There's a bridge ahead, a small one, stone arch, single lane, built for farm carts and cattle. German engineers either missed it during their demolition sweep or decided it wasn't worth the charges. It spans the Mosel at a point where the river narrows to maybe 60 feet, and it looks, in the fog, in the dark, to men who've been drinking captured Riesling for 3 hours, like it might hold a Sherman. Might. Stories like this one survive by accident. A clerk's note in a unit log. A lieutenant's letter home that contradicts the official timeline. If you want these fragments to keep surfacing, instead of vanishing into archive boxes, nobody opens. A like and a subscribe go further than you'd think. And if you've heard a version of this story from a grandfather or an uncle, drop it in the comments, because the official record has holes you could drive a tank through. The bridge had no tactical designation. It appears on a 1936 German Ordnance Survey map held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, cataloged under a reference number that leads to a water-damaged folder containing 11 sheets. 3 of those sheets are illegible. The bridge appears on one of the surviving 8, marked with a symbol indicating a load limit of 8 metric tons. A Sherman M4 A3 with a full combat load weighed roughly 33 tons. The math doesn't work, but nobody in that turret had the map, and nobody did the math. What the staff sergeant had, besides Riesling, amounted to a hunch and a standing frustration. 3rd Army's advance to the Rhine had been methodical, phase-lined, controlled. Patton wanted speed, but the logistics tail kept snapping taut. Bridges over the Mosel had been dropping for days as German engineers worked their way south with demolition teams. Every intact crossing found meant a day saved. Every day saved meant, in the particular arithmetic George Patton practiced, German units that couldn't consolidate, positions that couldn't harden, a war that ended sooner. The staff sergeant didn't think in those terms. He thought in terms of the bridge right in front of him and the fact that the far bank looked empty. Crew apparently inebriated, reads a note in the battalion S3 journal, entered after the fact in a hand different from the usual clerk's. The word apparently, doing a lot of diplomatic work in that sentence. The note gives no time of crossing. It gives no authorization reference, because none existed. At some point between midnight and 1 a.m. on March 4th, 1945, the driver dropped the Sherman into gear and rolled onto a stone bridge rated for a quarter of its weight, over a river nobody had ordered them to cross, toward a town whose garrison strength appeared in no intelligence summary available below division level. Headlights off, intercom open, radio dead. The fog held. How does a tank crew end up 600 yards past its own phase line, on the wrong side of a river, with no orders and no radio contact, and nobody notices for 11 hours? The easy answer is discipline failure. 5 men got drunk and went rogue. That's the version a court-martial board would have used if anything had gone badly enough to require one. But the easy answer ignores the system that made it possible, and that system tells you more about why Germany lost the war than any single battle does. By March of 1945, the United States Army and the European theater had developed a problem that no military organization in history had previously encountered. It moved too fast for its own communications architecture. The Signal Corps had built a radio net designed around the assumption that divisions advanced at a pace set by infantry legs and logistics trucks, maybe 10 miles a day during offensive operations, less in rough terrain. Third Army's armored spearheads in the spring of 1945 routinely covered 30. On certain days in early April, elements of the 4th Armored Division pushed 50 miles in 24 hours across central Germany, blowing through towns whose names hadn't appeared in any briefing because the S2 shop hadn't expected to reach them for another week. The SCR 508 radio sets mounted in Shermans had a reliable voice range of roughly 10 to 15 miles under good atmospheric conditions. Hilly terrain along the Mosel cut that to 8. A tank platoon running 30 miles ahead of its battalion command post didn't have a communications gap. It had a communications void. The net simply ended, and everything beyond it operated on the last order received, which might be 12 hours old, and referred to a tactical situation that no longer existed. The German army couldn't process this. Their operational doctrine, inherited from the Prussian General Staff tradition, refined through 4 years of Eastern Front warfare, treated command and control as the skeleton of military action. Units without orders didn't advance. They held position, established contact with higher headquarters, and waited. A German Kampfgruppe commander who lost radio contact with his division pulled back to the last known friendly line. He did not push forward into unknown territory on personal initiative unless he held specific authorization to do so, and that authorization came with phase lines, boundaries, and timed reporting requirements that made American planning look like a napkin sketch by comparison. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the remnants of the Panzer-Lehr Division in those same weeks, gave a post-war statement to American interrogators that circles this exact confusion. He described American armored columns appearing in locations that German intelligence considered impossible given the known position of American supply depots. "We assumed a mistake in the reports," he said, "because the alternative, that American tank crews operated 40 or 50 miles beyond their logistical tether with no centralized control, violated every principle Bayerlein had learned in 30 years of professional soldiering. The reports kept coming. They weren't mistakes. What Bayerlein couldn't see, what no German commander on the Western Front fully grasped until after the war, amounted to a structural difference in how the two armies understood initiative. The American system tolerated freelancing, not officially. The field manuals prescribed coordination, communication, methodical advance, but the culture that produced American tank crews, small-town men, accustomed to making decisions without asking permission, trained by an army that expanded from 200,000 to 8 million in 4 years, and never had time to instill the kind of institutional obedience the Wehrmacht baked into its recruits from childhood. That culture generated staff sergeants from Outran, who looked at an undefended bridge and crossed it. The German word is Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, delegated authority to subordinate commanders. The German army invented the concept. Military historians have spilled considerable ink praising it. What they mention less often. By 1945, Auftragstaktik in the Wehrmacht had calcified into something closer to its opposite. Hitler's interference, the purge of initiative after the July 20th plot, the systematic replacement of experienced NCOs with hastily trained conscripts, the culture of denunciation that made risk-taking personally dangerous, all of it had produced a German army that followed orders rigidly or fell apart entirely. The institution that pioneered decentralized command couldn't practice it anymore. The American army, which had never read the theory, practiced it by accident every night along the Mosel. That's the context for a Sherman sitting on a mudflat with 3 drunk crewmen and no orders. The system didn't fail. The system created a condition where individual crews routinely operated beyond oversight, and then it relied on the aggregate judgment of those crews to produce outcomes that centralized planning couldn't achieve. Most of those outcomes were mundane. A platoon loggered in the wrong field, a company that missed a turn and ended up a mile south of its objective. The catastrophic ones were friendly fire incidents born from units that didn't know where their neighbors stood. And once in a while, a staff sergeant found an intact bridge. The smell inside a Sherman after 8 hours of continuous operation hits somewhere between a machine shop and a locker room. Hot oil, cordite residue baked into every surface, the copper tang of electrical insulation running warm, and 5 men who haven't washed in a week. The Continental R975 radial engine behind the firewall pumps heat forward into the fighting compartment like a furnace with opinions. In winter, that heat keeps crews alive. In summer, it cooks them. In March along the Mosel, with fog pressing against the hull and the temperature outside hovering near freezing, it split the difference. The crew sweated from the waist up and went numb from the knees down, boots sitting in a half-inch of condensation that pooled on the hull floor and never dried. That engine is the reason any of this happened. The Riesling didn't matter. The fog didn't matter. The staff sergeant's hunch didn't matter. The engine. The R975 had a mean time between failures that no German tank power plant could touch. A Panther's Maybach HL-230. O required a full engine rebuild every 150 kilometers under combat conditions, and that's the manufacturer's optimistic number. Field reports from panzer units on the Western Front in late 1944 put the actual figure closer to 80. The Sherman's Continental ran for well over 1,000 miles between major overhauls. It started in cold weather and hot weather alike. It started after sitting idle for 2 weeks in a Norman hedgerow. The staff sergeant's driver worried about the starter, and that worry tells you something about the exception proving the rule. The fact that a bulky starter registered as notable meant everything else on that tank worked. The transmission shifted. The tracks held tension. The 75mm gun traversed and elevated without binding. The radio picked up and transmitted on frequency. A crew could climb into a Sherman after a day of hard driving, turn the key, and expect it to go. German crews performed the same ritual as prayer. The Wehrmacht's postwar assessments circle this point with a kind of baffled repetition that borders on obsession. General Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, writing in his FMS report on armored operations, devoted an entire section to what he called the mechanical endurance of American armor, not its protection or firepower, but its ability to simply keep running. He compared it unfavorably to German designs in every category, except the one that mattered most. The American tank appeared where it should not have been possible for it to appear, because it had driven distances that would have immobilized half a German panzer company. That assessment, written from a prison camp, carries the weight of a man trying to explain to himself how he lost. The engine kept running. The logistics system kept feeding it. Those two facts cannot be separated. A Sherman consumed roughly 1 gallon of gasoline per mile under combat conditions. Third Army's fuel consumption in March of 1945 averaged over 350,000 gallons per day. The Red Ball Express had wound down by then, replaced by a more permanent pipeline and depot network stretching from Cherbourg to the front, but the principle remained identical. American industrial capacity translated into a logistical depth that made individual tank crews functionally independent of their immediate supply chain for days at a time. A Sherman carried enough fuel for roughly 100 miles of road movement. It carried 71 rounds of main gun ammunition and several thousand rounds of machine gun belting. A crew that broke contact with its parent unit didn't immediately face starvation or mechanical death. It could operate and fight. It could cross a river at midnight and still have enough gasoline, to reach the next town, and enough shells to argue about who owned it. The German army in 1945 couldn't do this, couldn't come close. Panzer units hoarded fuel in jerry cans because the depot system had collapsed under Allied bombing. Crews abandoned operational tanks for lack of 20 liters of gasoline. A captured German logistics officer, his interrogation report sits in the US SBS files, declassified in 1973, told his American questioners that by February, his division allocated fuel by the individual vehicle, personally approved by the division commander each morning. Each morning. Every tank, every half-track, every motorcycle required a signature before it could move. The Americans allocated fuel by the trainload and then lost track of where half of it went. That gap, between a system so starved it rationed by the vehicle and a system so abundant it couldn't account for its own surplus, explains why a single Sherman could wander off the map and still function as a combat-capable weapons system 72 hours later. The staff sergeant didn't need permission to cross the river because he didn't need anything from the people who would have given it. His tank ran, and his gun worked. His fuel tanks held enough to get somewhere interesting. The bridge groaned under 33 tons and held. Feldwebel Karl Bremer stepped outside to urinate and heard the grinding, metal on stone, low, rhythmic, impossibly close. He stood in the doorway of a requisitioned schoolhouse on the eastern edge of the town, a Mosel village of maybe 300 people whose name appears in the unit diary as Neumagen, though the full municipal name ran longer, and the sound came from the west, from the river, from a direction that contained, as far as Bremer's company commander had briefed him 6 hours earlier, no enemy forces of any kind. The river served as the defensive line. German engineers had dropped every bridge between Bernkastel and Trittenheim. Bremer's Volksgrenadier Company held the eastern bank with the confidence of men standing behind a moat. The grinding grew louder, steel treads chewing cobblestone. Bremer's account, preserved in a fragment of an interrogation transcript dated March 19, 1945, 14 pages of which survive in the First Army intelligence files, describes what happened next with the flatness of a man still processing disbelief. He went back inside. He woke his platoon leader. The platoon leader, an Oberleutnant whose surname the transcript renders as either Voss or Vus, told Bremer he must be hearing a German vehicle. Bremer said there were no German vehicles. The Oberleutnant told him to go back to sleep. The Sherman rolled into the town square at approximately 01:30 hours, headlights still off. The driver navigated by the glow of the instrument panel reflected off the fog, which had thickened as the tank climbed the gentle slope from the riverbank into the village. The bowgunner, the only completely sober member of the crew, a detail the battalion S3 journal confirms, with the pointed observation that assistant driver remained capable throughout. The bowgunner had his hatch cracked 2 inches, calling out obstacles, a stone wall, a parked handcart, a pile of rubble from a building that Allied fighter bombers had clipped sometime in February. Then a gap, barely wide enough. The Sherman threaded through the main street at walking pace, and the vibration of 33 tons on medieval cobblestones transmitted through every stone foundation in the village. Plates rattled in cupboards. Dust fell from ceiling beams. The sound carried the particular deep-frequency rumble that men who've experienced it describe as felt in the chest before heard in the ears, a physical pressure, the air itself thickening. Bremer heard it again from inside the schoolhouse. This time, the Oberleutnant heard it too. What followed compressed into roughly 12 minutes, though Bremer's account gives no timestamps, and the Sherman crew's recollection, filtered through Riesling and adrenaline, and 11 days of retroactive justification before anyone wrote anything down, conflicts on sequence. The staff sergeant traversed the turret toward the schoolhouse, which showed light through a blackout curtain that didn't fully cover one window. The gunner laid the 75 on the front door from 40 yards. The loader chambered an HE round with hands that had been holding a wine bottle 90 minutes earlier. Nobody fired. The staff sergeant popped his hatch, stood up in the turret ring with the fog swirling at chest height, and shouted something into the dark. The interrogation transcript records Bremer's version of what he heard. American shouting, not words, just shouting. Bremer's platoon had 19 men, 2 MG-42s, and a Panzerfaust. Against a Sherman at 40 yards in a village street, the Panzerfaust represented a genuine threat. One hit to the hull side, at that range, would have killed everyone inside. The MG-42s would have done nothing but announce positions and invite the 75mm response that would have turned the schoolhouse into a memory. Bremer knew this. The Oberleutnant apparently knew it too, because what Bremer describes next carries the specific weight of men, making a survival calculation very quickly. They put a white bedsheet out the window. 19 Volksgrenadiers surrendered to 5 Americans, 3 of whom couldn't walk a straight line. The staff sergeant climbed down from the turret, accepted the Oberleutnant's sidearm, and, according to the single sentence in the unit diary that describes this moment, secured 20 PWs and the eastern approaches to the bridge. Secured. As if it had been the plan all along. The town held no strategic value. The bridge behind them held enormous value. An intact Mosel crossing, undemolished, now with American armor on both sides of it. The staff sergeant, drunk or not, recognized this. He positioned the Sherman facing east, covering the only road into town from the German interior, and waited. Dawn came around, 06:45. The fog began to lift. The driver shut the engine off, and the starter question became relevant again. For 5 hours, that Sherman sat alone on the wrong side of the Mosel, its crew sobering up in the cold, guarding a bridge that Third Army didn't know it owned. The radio stayed dead. 12 miles west, at the battalion command post in a converted farmhouse outside Wittlich, the situation map showed the staff sergeant's Sherman parked in an assembly area on the friendly side of the Mosel. A grease pencil X marked its last reported position from the previous evening's radio check. 21:15 hours, all nominal, crew accounted for. The S3 officer on night duty had gone to sleep at midnight. His replacement arrived at 0500, glanced at the map, saw nothing unusual, and started heating coffee on a Coleman stove. The map stayed wrong for another 6 hours. The lag reveals something American military historians tend to skip past when celebrating initiative and audacity. The same system that freed a tank crew to cross a river also meant that nobody in a position of authority had any idea where that crew had gone or what it had done. The battalion commander woke at 0530, received his morning briefing, and made decisions about the day's operations based on a map that placed one of his Shermans 600 yards from its actual position. On the wrong side of a river, his unit hadn't been ordered to cross. He requested air support for a crossing operation, scheduled for March 20th. He coordinated artillery fires against the eastern bank. Fires that would have landed on his own crew if the fog hadn't delayed the fire mission by 3 hours. The after-action report, filed 4 days later, when the chronology had been reconstructed from memory and journal fragments, uses the phrase unit displacement not reflected in operational graphics. Military language has a gift for making near catastrophe sound like a filing error. Meanwhile, Bremer's surrender set off a chain reaction that the staff sergeant hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. Neumagen contained more than one German position. The schoolhouse platoon represented roughly a third of the Volksgrenadier Company, holding that stretch of riverbank. 2 additional squads occupied houses on the northern edge of the village, perhaps 200 yards from the town square, and a mortar team, 2 8-centimeter tubes with limited ammunition, sat in a garden behind the church. These positions heard the Sherman arrive. They heard the shouting. They did not hear gunfire, which created a problem no German field manual addressed. What do you do when the enemy takes your neighboring position without a shot and you can't reach your company commander by telephone because the wire got cut sometime during the night? The answer, for the squad leader in the northernmost house, took roughly 40 minutes to formulate. His name doesn't appear in any surviving document. He sent a runner south toward the company command post, a full kilometer away, and waited. The runner never came back. Sources conflict on why. He may have deserted, gotten lost in the fog, or simply decided that running through contested ground in the dark to report the impossible presence of an American tank ranked low among his personal priorities. The war had 11 weeks left. Men made calculations. By 02:15, the northern squads knew the schoolhouse had surrendered. They could see the Sherman silhouette in the square, gun tube pointed east, engine idling. The staff sergeant had remounted and buttoned up, prisoners sitting against the schoolhouse wall under the bow gunner's watch. One MG-42 crew in the northern position had a clear line of fire on those prisoners, and on the Sherman's left flank, they held fire. The Panzerfaust team attached to their squad had expended its single round 2 weeks earlier against a low-flying P-47 and missed. They had rifles, 2 machine guns, grenades, and no weapon that could crack a Sherman's hull. At 02:40, the squad leader in the northern house made his decision. He walked out his front door carrying a rifle by the barrel, muzzle down, and approached the Sherman alone. The staff sergeant, watching through his periscope, let him come. 30 yards, 20. The German set the rifle on the cobblestones and raised both hands. His squad followed. Then, the mortar team behind the church, who had been sitting in silence with rounds they couldn't usefully fire at a target 40 yards from their own men. 37 additional prisoners, bringing the total to 56, 1 Sherman, 5 Americans, no orders from anyone. Position reported by Feldwebel Bremer's company as overrun by enemy armor in estimated battalion strength. That line comes from the German divisional log, timed at 0400 hours, meaning the company commander, when he finally learned what happened, reported an entire battalion, where 5 men and 1 tank actually sat. He multiplied the threat by a factor of roughly 30. The fog, the noise, the speed of collapse, all of it inflated a single Sherman into an armored assault that demanded divisional response. The German division pulled 2 reserve platoons off the line south of Trittenheim to prepare a counterattack against a force that didn't exist. Those platoons left a gap. Through that gap, 8 hours later, an actual American infantry company crossed the Mosel in assault boats without opposition. The staff sergeant's map still showed him on the western bank. The static broke at 11:47 hours with a sound like frying bacon. A long hiss, then a pop, then a voice the S3 officer didn't recognize because the staff sergeant's loader had grabbed the handset and was talking too fast, swallowing half his words. The battalion radio log captures the exchange in abbreviated notation that reads like a man transcribing a fever dream. Item 37. Reports position East Bank Mosel vicinity Nijmegen, claims 56 PW, requests instructions. The radio operator at battalion wrote claims and underlined it. He called the S3. The S3 looked at his map, looked at the grease pencil X on the western bank, and asked the operator to authenticate. The loader didn't know the day's authentication code. He'd never needed it before. The tank commander handled radio protocol, and the staff sergeant had apparently decided that 11 hours of radio silence followed by an unauthenticated transmission from the wrong side of a river constituted a reasonable way to reintroduce himself to the chain of command. The S3 refused to accept the report. For 14 minutes, a staff officer sitting in a farmhouse with hot coffee argued with a loader sitting in a cold Sherman, surrounded by 56 German prisoners, about whether the loader occupied the position he occupied. The loader, to his credit, suggested the S3 come see for himself. The log records this as Item 37, requests visual confirmation of position. The S3 recorded it as possible enemy deception on battalion frequency. He began drafting a report about compromised communications. The battalion commander intervened at 12:01. He'd overheard the exchange from the next room, walked in, took the handset, and asked one question. The log doesn't record what it said, only that the response convinced him. Perhaps a detail only the real crew would know. Perhaps the staff sergeant finally got on the radio himself. The record skips those minutes. What it does record, at 12:08, is the battalion commander calling regiment to report that he held a bridgehead across the Mosel with 1 tank and 5 men, requesting immediate reinforcement and cancellation of the opposed crossing planned for the following day. Regiment's response took 45 minutes. 45 minutes to authorize exploitation of a bridge that American armor had held for over 10 hours. The regimental S3 had to call division. Division had to call corps. Corps had to reconcile the existence of this bridgehead with an operational timeline that didn't include a Mosel crossing until March 20th at the earliest. Planning documents needed revision, artillery coordination required updating, and air support requests already submitted to 19th Tactical Air Command needed amendment on top of all of it. The bureaucracy of war ground forward at its own speed, indifferent to the fact that 5 men had already accomplished what an entire battalion had been scheduled to do with full fire support, engineer assets, and a 2-day preparatory bombardment. The parallel to Remagen is almost too neat. 3 weeks earlier, on March 7th, Sergeant Alexander Drabik sprinted across the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine at Remagen, a bridge that every German demolition team had failed to drop, and American infantry seized a crossing that Scheff's operational plan didn't anticipate for another month. How that particular piece of information traveled up the chain of command is its own tangent. The First Army commander, General Hodges, learned about Remagen from a radio intercept of a German broadcast reporting the bridge's capture before his own units called it in. He heard it from the enemy first. Bradley, when Hodges phoned him, asked if the bridge could hold traffic. Hodges said yes. Bradley called Eisenhower, who told him to push everything across. The entire authorization chain, from sergeant on the bridge to supreme commander in Versailles, collapsed into about 90 minutes. But that's beside the point. The Mosel crossing lacked Remagen's strategic scale. Nobody called Eisenhower about Neumagen. The authorization loop closed at corps level, and by 1400 hours on March 18th, 2 additional Shermans and a platoon of armored infantry had crossed the bridge the staff sergeant found. By nightfall, the bridgehead held a full company. The opposed crossing planned for the 20th never happened. Engineers reinforced the bridge instead of building a new one. The staff sergeant's crew, still in their original Sherman, still in the town square, watched the reinforcements arrive from the turret hatches with the particular expression of men who've done something either brilliant or court-martial worthy and haven't yet learned which. The battalion commander visited the bridgehead personally at 15:30. The after-action report describes his inspection in one sentence. CO observed position and found it satisfactory. Found it satisfactory. A drunk, unauthorized, unplanned river crossing that captured 56 prisoners, seized an intact bridge, triggered a German divisional redeployment, and opened a gap that an infantry company exploited 8 hours later. Satisfactory. The staff sergeant received no disciplinary action. He also received no decoration. His name appears nowhere in the regimental citation for the Mosel crossing. The loader's name, the gunner's name, the driver who worried about the starter, the bow gunner who stayed sober, none of them appear. The battalion diary lists the event under opportunistic crossings, alongside 2 others that month, none described in more than 4 lines. The Riesling gets no mention at all. 0400 hours, March 18th, 1945. Hauptmann Werner Feldt stood in the cellar of a farmhouse 1 kilometer south of Neumagen and tried to raise his 2nd platoon on a field telephone that returned nothing but the hollow click of a severed line. He cranked the handle again. Click, again, click. The cellar smelled of turned earth and old potatoes, and the particular sourness of men who've slept in their uniforms for weeks. A smell Feldt had stopped noticing sometime around Christmas, but that hit him fresh whenever he came in from outside, where the March air carried river damp and the faint chemical sweetness of cordite from shelling earlier that evening. Feldt's post-war account survives in the Foreign Military Studies series, filed as a supplementary annex to a broader report on Volksgrenadier Division operations west of the Rhine. It runs 11 pages, handwritten in careful script, composed in 1946, while Feldt sat in an American detention camp near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. The document bears a classification stamp that someone later crossed out with a single pen stroke. Declassified in 1978, it sat unread in the National Archives for decades. A graduate student at Ohio State pulled it for a dissertation on small unit actions in the Mosel Valley. The dissertation went unpublished. Feldt commanded the Volksgrenadier Company that held the Neumagen sector. Bremer reported to him. The Oberleutnant Voss, or Voos, reported to him. The mortar team behind the church reported to him. All of them had stopped reporting to him by 0245, and he didn't know why. His runner had not returned. His telephone lines ran dead in 2 directions. His remaining platoon, dug in along a tree line south of the village, reported no contact, no movement, no sound except the distant idling of what their platoon leader described as at least 4 engines, possibly more. 1 engine. The fog did something to acoustics that multiplied everything. Feldt's account describes the next 3 hours with a precision that reads like a man constructing his own defense brief. He sent a situation report to battalion at 0400, estimating enemy strength at 1 armored company, 10 to 14 tanks, supported by infantry of unknown size. He requested artillery support. Battalion denied the request because the division's remaining guns had been allocated to a different sector, and the ammunition situation permitted no speculative fires. He requested permission to counterattack with his remaining platoon. Battalion told him to hold in place and await developments. Hold in place, with 1 platoon, no communications forward, and an enemy force of imaginary size sitting in his village. At 0700, the fog thinned enough that Feldt crawled forward to an observation point on a low ridge overlooking Neumagen from the south. He carried binoculars that fogged instantly in the damp. He wiped them on his sleeve, raised them, and saw what broke him. 1 tank, a single Sherman, parked in the town square, gun tube covering the eastern road. His prisoners, his men, sitting in a row against the schoolhouse wall. A few American soldiers moving between buildings with the unhurried gait of men who felt no threat. Feldt counted them. He writes, "Ich zählte 5 Amerikaner. 5. I counted 5 Americans. 5. The word appears twice in his manuscript, underlined both times. His entire defensive position, 3 platoons, 2 mortars, overlapping fields of fire designed to repel a battalion-strength river crossing, had collapsed against 5 men. The defensive scheme assumed the enemy would cross under fire, take casualties on the bank, fight through prepared positions under mortar and machine gun coverage. The scheme did not assume the enemy would simply drive across an intact bridge at 1 in the morning and park." Feldt lay on that ridge for 2 hours. The cold seeped through his greatcoat into his ribs, into his hip bones, where they pressed against frozen ground. His hands went numb around the binoculars. He watched the Americans brew coffee on the engine deck of the Sherman. The Continental radial threw enough heat to boil water if you set the pot in the right spot, a trick every Sherman crew in the ETO knew. He watched his own soldiers accept cups, prisoners drinking American coffee in his village, in his sector, under his nominal command. The bitter smell carried on the morning air, or perhaps he invented that detail in retrospect. Memory does things like that. At 0915, Feldt withdrew his remaining platoon south without authorization. He made no counterattack. His account offers no justification beyond a single sentence that carries more weight than anything else in the 11 pages. Es hatte keinen Sinn. It made no sense. Not, it would have failed, or, we lacked the strength. It made no sense. The grammar of the war itself had changed, and Feldt recognized it from a frozen ridge with fogged binoculars, watching 5 Americans, who had no right to be there, drink coffee on a tank that had crossed a river no one ordered it to cross. The divisional counterattack he'd been promised never materialized. Those reserve platoons pulled from Trittenheim marched north, found the gap they'd created behind them, already filled by American infantry from the assault boat crossing, and surrendered by nightfall. Feldt surrendered 3 days later, on March 21st, to an armored column on a road east of Bernkastel. He carried no sidearm. He'd thrown it in the Mosel. The Luger sits in a display case at a VFW post in Zanesville, Ohio, or it did, as of 2014, when a local newspaper ran a photograph of it, alongside a brief caption identifying it as a German officer's sidearm recovered from the Mosel River area, March 1945. No name attached, no story. Just a pistol in a glass box between a folded flag and a unit photograph from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, dated 1943. Whether it belonged to Feldt, whether someone fished it from the river, or whether Feldt misremembered throwing it and actually handed it over at surrender, the records don't say. The German army that produced Werner Feldt had, 4 years earlier, operated the most effective decentralized command structure on Earth. Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, originated in Prussian doctrine and gave German junior officers latitude that their French and British counterparts spent the entire First World War begging for. A German lieutenant in 1940 received an objective and chose his own route. A German sergeant adapted to conditions without waiting for permission. The system conquered France in 6 weeks. By March of 1945, that system had eaten itself. The Wehrmacht's late-war command culture ran on fear. Initiative got men killed, not by the enemy, but by their own superiors. Feldt requested permission to counterattack and received orders to hold in place. His battalion commander lacked authority to release artillery without divisional approval. His division couldn't reallocate reserves without corps consent. Every decision climbed a ladder that got taller, as the men who'd once made those decisions independently lay dead in Russia, North Africa, Normandy. The replacements, older, younger, less trained, more afraid, defaulted upward. A Feldwebel in 1940 would have organized his own counterattack against that Sherman. Bremer in 1945 walked outside to urinate, saw a tank, and surrendered. 4 years of attrition had stripped the nerve out of the German NCO Corps, the way termites hollow a beam. The shape remains, the structure collapses under weight. The American system ran the opposite direction. The gruesome thing about fighting Americans, wrote General Major Friedrich von Broich in a recorded conversation at Trent Park in 1943, is that they don't follow their own plans. Broich meant it as criticism. He'd commanded in Tunisia and found American tactical behavior baffling. Units that deviated from obvious doctrinal patterns, sergeants who made decisions that should have required a captain's authorization, tank crews that appeared in places no rational operational analysis would predict. Broich called it indiscipline. He lost anyway. The staff sergeant at Neumagen embodied exactly what Broich described. Rational operational analysis does not predict a crew getting drunk on captured Riesling, crossing an uncleared bridge at 0100, and capturing a village by accident. Doctrine doesn't account for it, and defensive schemes can't prepare for it. The German army in 1940 could have handled the situation because German NCOs in 1940 still possessed the autonomy and aggression to counterattack a single tank with grenades and guts. The German army in 1945 couldn't handle it because every man who might have acted waited for orders from a commander who couldn't see, couldn't communicate, couldn't decide, and couldn't reach anyone who could. The American advantage at Neumagen had nothing to do with the Sherman's armor or its gun or its Continental radial engine. Those specifications mattered only insofar as they delivered 5 men to a place where their willingness to act, drunk, lost, unsupervised, collided with an enemy's institutional inability to react. Feldt saw 5 Americans from his ridge and recognized the mathematics, not the numbers, the velocity. 5 men moving at the speed of their own judgment against a system that moved at the speed of its longest communication line. One detail nags. The staff sergeant's name appears in the battalion morning report for March 18, 1945. A routine administrative document listing duty status, casualties, assignments. It appears again on March 25th in a transfer order moving him to a replacement depot. Then, nothing. The unit files contain no discharge record, no forwarding address, no subsequent mention in any document the National Archives holds for that regiment. The morning reports from the replacement depot for that week are missing. Water damage, according to the archivist's note, from a warehouse flood in 1973 in St. Louis, the same fire and flood disaster that destroyed roughly 80% of Army personnel records from the period. Feldt's 11-page manuscript mentions the American tank commander once, near the end, almost as an afterthought. He describes seeing the staff sergeant climb out of the turret hatch as reinforcements arrived. A young man, Feldt writes, with no helmet and a dark stain on his jacket that could have been oil or wine. Feldt watched him through binoculars from a kilometer away, already withdrawing, already finished. He does not speculate about the man's name or rank or home state. 5 men, 1 Sherman, 56 prisoners, 1 intact bridge, 11 hours unnoticed, Zero orders. The staff sergeant's service record burned in St. Louis. Whatever happened to him after March 25, 1945, the United States Army has no file on the matter.